Good afternoon. We'll just give it a few seconds while we see people joining us. It's really good to have so many people with us today, and we'll start this group in a moment. So thank you. If you need to grab a drink or anything, do it and settle in, and then we'll be able to get started in just a minute or two. I always love watching the number just tick up on the side as I see everybody coming in. So I think we're almost there now. Okay, right, I'll get started. Thank you very much to everybody for joining us. I'm really privileged to be starting the new series of Youth Work Insight sessions from MYO's Learning Forums on equality and inclusion. My name is Abby McClatchy. So for those of you who I haven't met, and I'm sure a lot of you I have, I'm the Director of Youth Work and the Deputy Chief Exec at the MYO. I am here purely to facilitate this session. I do not have any specific expertise in this area, and that's why we bring together panels of brilliant humans to create a space for us to connect and to learn and to share and to develop our knowledge. So this year we're looking specifically at disability, abilities and differences, and we're focusing very much on, well, what happens when we really assume that all young people actually have capacity, possibility, and really protect the rights for all young people, regardless of how they operate in the world. So today we have got an absolutely incredible panel, and what I'm going to start with is just getting each of them to introduce themselves to you, tell you a little bit about themselves and their work, and then we'll move straight into the discussion. Just to let you know, before we start that, we are recording this session, and post this you will get access to the recording, so you can use it for your learning and development, but it's closed to this group. We will share any resources or research or anything that might be indicated by any of the panelists afterwards. And also we do have our colleagues Zaina and Karen here as well, who some of you will also know, and they'll be fielding and monitoring any questions that come through, so we can flow them through to the panel a bit later. Without any further ado, let's get started. And I'm going to start with the person who is first on my screen, and that's you, Joanna. So Joanna, could you just introduce yourself, please?
Absolutely. Thanks, Abby. Lovely to see you all this afternoon. I'm Joanna Carr. I'm the Assistant Director for Participation at the National Children's Bureau and the Council for Disabled Children, which sits within National Children's Bureau. The Council for Disabled Children is the umbrella organisation for children's disability in England, and my role directly supports children and young people to share their voice and their lived experiences with strategic leaders, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, I'm sure, in due course. So I'll pass along to the next person.
Brilliant. Thank you, Joanna. I'm sure lots of people will be connecting with different points that you raised there about participation and broad rights and advocacy. So there'll be lots to gain from that today. Thank you. Zara, over to you.
I'm Zara Todd. I'm a freelance trainer and facilitator. I have a background in youth work and have been doing youth work for about 20 years. I'm a disabled person and I'm neurodivergent, and I'm particularly interested in how we support young disabled people to be in groups with other young disabled people of different impairment types, but also to be in groups with non-disabled young people. So how we manage the dynamics of being accessible and inclusive to everyone in as strong a way as possible. Over to Tig.
Thanks, Sarah. Tig, over to you.
Hello, everybody. My name's Tig Saiter. I'm an academic. I work at Sheffield Hallam University, and I do research which is around disability, but also trans people's experiences. So I guess I'm coming at this kind of thinking about that intersection between trans and disability. I'm a trans autistic person myself, and I use they, them pronouns.
Wonderful, thank you. So as you'll hear from our panel, we've got a really wide breadth of knowledge and expertise. We've got Zara's work, obviously incredibly rooted directly in youth work practice and direct engagement with inclusive youth work. We've got Joanna, who's very focused on policy and advocacy and active participation in leadership. And we've got Tig talking about intersectional approaches and how we better understand that in terms of our work. So we've got an absolutely brilliant panel, and I think we're going to really get some opportunities to learn lots of cool things today that can help us all in our practice. As I said, any questions, just flow them through, and Zaina and Karen will pull them through. There are no wrong questions, like nobody knows all the answers. These are the opportunities that we have to engage with people who are really skilled and have brilliant expertise. So please feel free to use that question function as much as you can. So okay, we're going to maintain the same structure that we did with our insight sessions last year, because that seemed to create a good natural flow. So we're going to start today, panel, by thinking about people. And what I mean by that is thinking about what are the kinds of things that young people with disabilities and differences need, but also what we as workers might need to do our best when we're working with the breadth of difference and inclusivity. So I'm going to ask us to start thinking about things like knowledge, attitudes and assumptions, and how they might shape our interactions. So I thought we might start by talking about the social model of disability, power, autonomy, some of those kind of concepts. So let's focus in on the social model of disability to begin with. And I'm just wondering what that might mean to you and how it might show up or not in broader practice and youth work practice with young people. So Zara, thinking about the social model of disability, could you give us a little bit of an explanation about what that might mean to you?
So the social model of disability was developed by disabled people, and it basically says that there are barriers in society that disable us. Now, there are generally 4 categories of barriers: so environmental, attitudinal, communication, and institutional. And when I think about what that means in a youth work context, it's about how do we remove those barriers to enable as many young people, disabled or not, to be able to take part in what we do. So it's looking at whether our policies and procedures are supporting disabled young people to take part or causing extra barriers and time and stuff. It's about looking at, are we actually doing activities in venues that are accessible, not just physical access, but also thinking about like the audio environment. Can people get there? Like it's a really useful framework to kind of look at how we do youth work and how we can make it accessible, because you can remove barriers to enable people to take part. For me personally, the social model is really important because it gives disabled children and young people a way of understanding who they are that doesn't make them the problem, but actually identifies that there are barriers that they experience. One of the complicated things about working with disabled children and young people is that they're evolving how they understand their own identities. So they might not come from a place where they understand that they're not the problem. So it's how, as youth workers, do we support them to kind of ask for what they need, to not try and like hide away because they don't want to be a burden or a problem, because they might have had negative ideas like reinforced in their experience of education and so on. So it's about how do we create a space and a place that can be kind of accessible and inclusive, but also support young disabled people and children to kind of step into their power and own that they're allowed to be there and they're allowed to have fun and they're allowed to have joy. One of the biggest things that comes up when people start kind of trying to explore this is they get a bit worried that they're going to say or do the wrong thing. And I think one of the things that's really important about the social model and just being inclusive in general is actually having conversations with young people and children about what they need to be included, rather than assuming that, oh, this must be a barrier. Actually have a conversation with them and say, how do you want to take part in this activity? What do you need to come to my youth club? Rather than, we need to do all of this without talking to Billy about what they need. And I think the other thing that's really important is, you may not have come across it because it's relatively new. If we're taking a disability justice approach to how we look at youth work, actually assuming that disabled children and young people are going to come to your spaces is really, really important, rather than looking and going, if someone comes, we'll remove the barriers. Actually, what can you do in advance to mean that young disabled people are more likely to come to you because they know that they're going to be welcomed and celebrated? Yeah.
That's, yeah, super helpful. And actually, I think that language of disability justice, it's definitely new to me. But I think it just makes perfect sense, doesn't it? So what you're talking about is, its social model is about its society that is disabling by creating barriers for inclusivity and accessibility. And so if we flip that to disability justice and assume that all of our spaces, physical, emotional, digital, should be inclusive, because we should be preempting barriers rather than waiting for them to be an issue. And I guess the other key thing, just summarising what you said there, was about having honest questions and being able to have that dialogue with young people and just be like, hey, how does this work for you? What can we do to enable enjoyment? I love the fact that you said about entitled to joy. I think that's probably going to be a real key phrase, like all young people should be entitled to joy, and disabled young people equally. So I think that brings us nicely on to you actually, Joanna, because I know a lot of your work is about strategic participation and how we empower young people, or move up to enable young people to have a space to lead and break down just some of those barriers. So do you want to talk to us a little bit about how your work enables some of the stuff that Zara talked about to happen?
Yeah, definitely. And just listening to Zara talk about the social model, it really resonates how much the social model of disability goes hand in hand with children and young people's voice and participation. And when I talk about strategic participation, I mean about involving children and young people in changing systems and frameworks and influencing policy directly, whether that's local community policies and processes, or whether that's thinking about how you work with national government to ensure children and young people can shape decision making. And I think, as Zara was saying, that sort of how do you involve children and young people in those conversations, particularly disabled children and young people, is that, well, they're already involving themselves as they should do. And for us, it is about actually how do we support and facilitate those conversations. Zara was talking very much around how you understand children and young people's support needs and how best to help them be part of conversations. And one of the very, very first things we do when we work with young people is to ask them, what do you need from us to be able to be involved in the ways that work best for you, and to make sure that we are supporting you in a really positive, empowering way. So we take our cue from young people all the time, and I don't need to know what a young person's disability or neurodiversity or their health condition is, because I'm not an expert in any of those things, but I am an expert in making sure that I can support them to be involved when I listen to them and understand what it is that they need from us as an organisation and a team. So I think once we understand that, for us it's that role of actually, okay, how do we make sure that you can be involved in those conversations? How can we meaningfully make sure that the professionals and the decision makers are really listening to you and taking your thoughts and your experiences on board to shape future development? And young people sort of take us on that journey with them. We work with children and young people who have a range of disabilities and support needs. We're not one condition specific, so bringing children and young people together in a room who have different support needs and different sort of ranges and sort of levels of where they're comfortable sharing their voice is a really empowering process for us as well as young people, because they get to see other young people who and work with other young people who they may not necessarily do. They get to see that actually they have real power in their voices, and that they really are able to shape systems and decision-making processes. And sort of part of our work is to make sure that when young people are talking, that decision makers are actually actioning what they're saying and sort of feeding back to young people. So quite a lot of our work is sort of framed around, if a young person does this or tells you this, what are you going to do with it? How do we make this meaningful for the young person? How do we make sure that actually what you're saying is, you're going to use that for some real positive sort of development sort of moving forward, and how can we build on that sort of continuously as well?
I think that's really interesting, because it definitely echoes what Zara was saying, which is about like, assume that we should be creating inclusive, accessible, diverse spaces for young people, rather than looking for the problems to create a barrier. And working from that basis, we should always be asking young people about how can we make this work for you? What are the things that you need from us to connect with Project X or Participation Y or whatever it is that we're doing? And I think your point about like really getting to grips with that and centering young people in that experience and in what comes as a result of that for other young people is really valuable. I think there's something that I've heard in both of what you said, which is about perhaps some of the assumptions that professionals or institutions might make about the abilities that young people have to engage. So there's definitely something here about like assumptions that people might make about young people. And I do wonder to what extent sort of social expectations might place limitations on young people's ability to engage. So it not being that I think it comes back to what Zara was saying about like, what are the barriers that we put in place that prevent inclusion rather than inclusion? So Tig, it'd be really helpful to hear from you here, actually, from sort of your broader research knowledge. Like, what are some of the things that that you think might limit or open up possibilities for disabled young people and intersectional young people more generally?
Yeah, thanks. It's really good to hear from the others too. I think one of the things, if we're thinking about disability justice, disability justice comes from it comes from disabled people of colour. That's like the place that kind of framework originated from. And I think a lot of disability justice is about thinking about stuff kind of really intersectionally. And by that, I mean that people have very multidimensional lives. So if you're a disabled person, you've also got a gender, a sexuality, you're racialized in particular ways, you have a class, etc. So kind of keeping that in mind at all times, but also thinking about that, how that works within society and within capitalism, and about how these big systems that we live in kind of are the things that limit possibility, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And as a reaction, I suppose, to certain assumptions that are made about disabled people and disabled young people who we're focusing on right now. So I've seen so often the kind of normative assumptions that young people face, all young people face, or particularly, I guess, non-disabled young people, I'm thinking here, like, you're going to grow up, you're going to have a job, you're going to get married, you're going to have kids. Often they're things that traditionally disabled young people, that might not have been an expectation for them. And as a reaction to that, I think sometimes it can almost go the other way and be like, oh, so we have to assume that disabled young people are going to want to get married and kind of fit into capitalism somehow with a kind of working life for paid money, because that's something that we value, and have children. And I think one thing to really do is to kind of explode our minds a little bit outside of that and think, okay, so how can we not just resist the not just end up forcing disabled young people into these pathways that could be quite harmful for all young people. So to not get into kind of heteronormative, assuming everybody's straight, assuming everybody's cis, to think about lives. You know, some disabled people aren't going to be able to work when they're adults, and to think, okay, let's think about different ways lives can be and different ways we can value people in humans and bodies, or embodied people. And I suppose resisting those kind of really normal, like, what do you want to be when you grow up, always just seems like such a boring question that we ask young people all the time and kids all the time, and instead say, well, how do you want the world to be different? So it's that kind of like, let's think really big. And I think that really fits with what Joanna was saying about kind of, you know, how can we change policy and practice and so on. But yeah, like, let's imagine the world otherwise and start from there, rather than thinking, how can disabled young people fit into this system we have? And let's start with asking disabled young people, what would you like the world to look like if you had your say about it? And then thinking about, yeah, how does that work within practice? How does that change kind of what a youth work setting might look like, and so on.
I love that. I really love the way that you describe that, which is just really thinking macro, really thinking big, like, why do we assume that the world is shaped in the right way? And actually, if we create spaces for inclusive voices, we might be able to recreate something, or not recreate, but we might be able to create a whole different perspective on life. And it's how we're really, how we're challenging ourselves, I think, in that, to think differently in our practice. And I guess you're right, taking what you said about how that really reflects or really connects to some of the stuff that Joanna was talking about. So Joanna, when you're thinking about sort of particularly some of that really strategic high level leadership work with young people, and Nundy, like, how do you see those things that Tig was talking about there about opening space up for young people to think about things differently? How does that work in your work, particularly for young people with diverse needs?
I think just sort of picking up what around, you know, that word assumptions. We already assume that young people, children, young people, young adults don't have the capacity to be involved, or the experience to be involved in really serious, for lack of a better term, decision making. And we know that's not true. We absolutely know that they can. And when you are a disabled young person, that assumption is double fold. Like, what could you possibly add to this conversation? And in fact, by the end of the conversation, we often realise that there is more that they can add to a conversation than we could possibly, you know, fit into, you know, into the project of work. And one of the key things that people often end meetings on is, well, this has been really inspirational, and it's a really well-meaning term, but the young people, particularly, you know, from the experience I have, the young people that I work with hate that term. They hate being called inspirational, because actually this is just their lives. This is them advocating for themselves. This is them advocating for other young people. And this is saying, actually, have we thought about doing this in a different way that removes the barriers for young people, particularly young disabled people? So I think the more that we can involve children and young people in conversations, disabled young people in conversations, the more we hope that there would be a culture change around the assumptions we make about disabled people and disabled young people. And I think the Lundy model, for example, is a really excellent framework for supporting us to do that. So the Lundy model of participation, many of you will already be aware of it, but it was created by Laura Lundy, who's an academic at the Queen's University Belfast. She's incredible. If you have an opportunity to be in any workshop with Laura Lundy, please go. She's fabulous. And it is a really simple concept around Article 12 of the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, which is the right to be involved in decision making in an appropriate, informed way that for any decision that would impact your life. And then obviously applies to children and young people. And there are 4 elements: the space, the voice, the audience, and the influence. And they are all interrelated, they are all linked, but all 4 of those elements need to really be in place for meaningful participation opportunities. And I often say that if you take one of them away, like we always talk about young people's voice, but without those sort of 4 key elements, young people are often speaking into a void because there's no clear linear way or circular way, I should say, to support that real systems change and give young people that opportunity to really be part of changing sort of systems and frameworks. And I won't talk about Laura Lundy's model for the whole meeting, so I wax lyrical about it. It is a great model. And we'll sort of share some resources about that afterwards. But we also use that alongside Phil Chesler's Degrees of Participation, which talks about the different ways in which you can involve children and young people to the degrees of their decision making, their ownership. So some of the things that we do are automatically created by adults that we bring young people into the conversations. But real change can happen when you also let children and young people be creative and identify what they feel needs to change, what they want to be involved in and what they want to be part of. I think those are 2 really powerful models of participation that really help us identify alongside young people where they feel their voices are going to have the most impact, and bringing them on that decision-making process with you can be incredibly enlightening.
Thanks, Joanna. And I think that one of the key things, again, in what you were saying there was about it's not having a specific model, a different model, thinking about things differently for a group of young people with a specific disability. It's about using inclusive frameworks that create spaces for young people of breadth of diversity to be able to influence change and shape things that really work for them. I wonder, Zara, whether you've got anything to add from your sort of youth work practice around sort of creative participation and co-design and engagement of services specifically with young people.
So I've done a lot of co-design and participatory research processes with young people, and particularly with disabled young people. And I just want to re-emphasize something that Tig mentioned earlier, and it's about actually creating the space to think big and not be confined by necessarily what you think young people are going to be interested in, or saying you can only kind of operate within a small framework. Like a lot of disabled young people I've worked with in particular express frustration that they're only ever allowed to engage in discussions about things that adults think disabled young people are interested in, whereas actually they want to be talking about climate change, they want to be talking about like LGBTQI issues, but all they're ever allowed to talk about is like health and disability. And so there's something about actually giving young people the freedom to set the agenda, to let them take an issue and decide what are the important things about it. I've done a lot of work in co-design, which is something that is very big in Scotland where I live, which is bringing young people together with adults to kind of address issues. And one of the big challenges in that is often, rightly so, to give young people space. Young people go and do their element of co-design, and then it's taken to a reference group of adults. And for me, that's not co-design, because actually, if you're looking at developing policy, there should be a conversation where it's not just, oh, we're taking it to power. Actually, the young people should have power. So when I've done co-design processes, I've advocated very strongly that young people are part of the advisory board, that what they create goes to, that they're not just given a slot at the agenda, they're there throughout. If that means you have to change how the meeting works to make it accessible and interesting and not something that they want to fall asleep in, then that's fine. Actually, it probably makes the meeting better for everyone. So there's things about how do you build in equality between young people and policymakers and decision makers and so on. There's also something about choice. So I've done a lot of work with particularly young disabled people carrying out research, and I've seen a lot of research projects, and people decide what's interesting and what's boring, and they say the young people can do this bit because it's interesting. In the model that I developed with Anita Franklin, we don't do that. We show the whole research process and literally say to the young people, what do you want to be involved in? Because it might be that someone really, really, really loves data analysis. It might be that someone really loves reading and wants to do a literature review. And I think we need to be giving young people the choice to get involved in everything the way that they want to, rather than prescribing what is interesting or what is not interesting. And it is our responsibility as youth workers that are holding these spaces to work out how we make them accessible. So it's not on the young people to fit into how policymakers or academics want to work. It's on us to go, actually, how do you want to work about this? And then take it to those spaces. And I'm going to hand over to Tig.
Tig.
I just wanted to add to what Zara was saying a little bit, in that I think it's a really good point to say that there's often this assumption when you're doing kind of inclusive research design that the inclusive bit you have to like use paint or do crafts or something. And actually, like for me, as someone who might participate in, as a participant in research as well as a researcher, like as soon as anyone tells me I've got to do some kind of art-based craft project or express my feelings through a sculpture, I run a mile away. If someone wants to do something very traditional with me, then I might be more up for being involved in that. So yeah, it's not assuming that to do stuff with disabled young people, and to be honest, I'd say disabled people more broadly, because I think it's just like, oh well, disabled people, they must need this special thing happening that's like a craft activity, some cutting and sticking, that'd be good. Yeah, to like not assume that that's the best way to get views from it. Might be great for some people as well. Like a diversity of options of ways to engage is always good, right?
And that's just good practice, isn't it? Like it should be good practice to think about creative ways that people can choose to engage, rather than to assume that person X must have need Y, therefore we need to get some sticky glue out. I think that's a really good point. And as you said, like people are different. Broadly speaking, you don't want to get engaged if somebody says, demonstrate your feelings through a sculpture. I particularly dislike those icebreakers where people go, so tell me something interesting about yourself. Like I just freeze. I have no idea what I'm going to say. I've got a really nice dog. Like, what do you want from me? I don't know what you actually really want. And so there's something about being able to be thoughtful and creative, and not assuming that, as you say, just because somebody has some sort of label of disability or diversity in terms of like neurodevelopment, that therefore only certain things are an option. I think that's the key message that I'm hearing from you, right, Zara?
Can I just also come in and say, like 80% of disabled people do not visibly look disabled. So one of the things that often happens is that people, like if I go into a room, I'm in a wheelchair, people run towards me and go, how can I help you? What do you need? And actually, when you're thinking about youth work and making things accessible and inclusive, it's not targeting the people that look like they might need it to be accessible and inclusive, but actually having a conversation with everyone about what they need to be in the room. And again, related to this, one of the things I've experienced, particularly around working with groups of disabled and non-disabled people, is sometimes organisations or settings only ask the disabled young people or the people that they perceive as disabled what they need, And sometimes that can cause real resentment because there might be other needs in the room that come from other identities or access things that they're not being asked, and actually they should be asked because everyone's a human being and everyone has needs. So it's about how you actually allow people to be human beings in your space and allow everyone to be human beings and everyone to have needs that might not be the cookie cutter things that you've accounted for. Like, and I think that that's a really important thing about creating equitable and inclusive spaces, because you're saying, yeah, we've got this thing, but it might not quite work for you. Let us know what does. The other thing that's really important around that is actually if you have done things to make the space accessible, like having a quiet room or having captioning or having fidget toys, don't hoard them and say they're only for people that say, I need them. If there's something that is available and there isn't a financial implication of more people having it, offer it to everyone, as long as they stick to the kind of, you're not going to make lots of noise in the quiet room. Like, there's no reason to just say that something is just for people that are willing to disclose. There is still a hell of a lot of stigma around being disabled, and certainly growing up with a disability, it's really difficult to negotiate what your identity and wanting to like fit in with people and not make a big deal. So the best way to not make a big deal is to make everything that makes something accessible available to everyone as far as possible.
I love that, Zara, and that really ties back in with what you were saying at the start about sort of disability justice, removing barriers by creating accessible and inclusive spaces. And your point about making things accessible to everybody really resonates with me. My son is he's got ADHD, so he's always needs to move. He's really physical. And I remember when he was at school saying, should we just buy some pedals to put under the desk? And we can just put them under all, and they were like, well, you can't do that. I was like, well, just buy them for everybody, put them in the whole class. Like, we've got the cash in the pupil premium pot. Let's just put them under everybody's tables, because then if people do find it easier to learn when they're moving, they can. But the practitioners, the teachers were horrified at this idea, because you should only do that for the children that need it. And so there's something there about what you're saying, which is about removing stigma by making things accessible for everybody, removing stigma by creating spaces where people don't have to wear a label and disclose things unless they want to, but that it feels like a safe space where they can. And I think that's a really good moment to sort of come on to think about spaces, actually. And I want us to think a little bit, because I think people will be quite interested in this stuff, about sort of like environments. So whether that's physical environments, cultural, digital, and how inclusive or exclusive they are. And you've already started to talk about that, Zara, but there's some stuff around like metaphors for what does access really mean. So Tig, I'm going to come to you to begin with. I know that you're not youth work specific and that you're more about society and research, but I'm just wondering if you've got any insights. I'm kind of looking to explore what our spaces might say to young people living with disabilities about who should be in there and who shouldn't, and how inclusive they are. And can you talk to us a little bit about some of your research around this and some of your knowledge?
I think one thing I was going to kind of riff off what Sarah was saying a little bit was that I think good accessibility makes a space more accessible for everybody. Like, to think about accessibility really broadly generally makes a space better for all the people that are there. And I think there's a lot to be learned from like disability arts in terms of like if you've ever gone to see like disability arts like performance or something, then often it's like accessibility is not like this boring add-on thing, but it's something that's really creative and like part of practice and like fundamental to everything that happens in that particular place or space. So to think of accessibility as something like just that we do always and that we think about always, and that is, yeah, can be fun and creative. To answer your actual question though, so some of my research has, or a lot of my research over the past decade has been about toilet access, and that is thinking about trans, queer and disabled people's access to toilets. Now, when I started this research, people often used to not really know how to react when I said I did research about toilets. So I would laugh and think that was something weird or funny. Now the reaction isn't quite like that because there's so much in the media about trans people's toilet access, obviously, and the landscape generally has gone fairly downhill. But leaving that aside for a second, I think the way that we've approached toilets, so doing research on toilets, is to use toilets as a starting place for thinking about accessibility. So the toilet isn't just the toilet, because if you don't have access to a toilet, you can't leave your house. So having access to a toilet gives you access to public life, right? So we've thought about what makes a safe and accessible toilet, which is a question in itself, but from there had these broader conversations about kind of identity, belonging, feeling like you have a place in the world. From disabled people's perspectives, like there's been loads of conversations about like, well, there might be an accessible toilet there, but actually it's been used as a storage room because they don't really expect us there. They have to have that thing, but they don't actually expect us to come. We're not. There's an academic called Tanya Tukoczki. She's based in Canada, and she talks about expected participants. And I think a lot of accessibility is about thinking like, to make a space accessible is to expect a range of people to be in that space. Another kind of toilet specific thing that we often talked about was how a building might like think about the aesthetics of its usually gendered toilets and think about like, oh, you might want some nice smellies in there, and there'd be a mirror and stuff. An accessible toilet is often really clinical, and like the mirror might not even be at the height of for a wheelchair user, or they might not bother with a mirror because disabled people don't really care what they look like. So it's those little things that are, yeah, the toilet's been able to teach me a lot, I think, in terms of accessibility, and thinking about what makes an accessible toilet is a starting place for thinking, well, what is our space saying to whether a range of people are welcome here? And to talk about trans people a minute specifically, that includes thinking about that, there's a massive crossover in terms of disability and people being trans, particularly thinking about neurodivergence. So to make your space accessible to disabled people, you need to be thinking about how your space could be trans inclusive as well. And that is not just relabeling the accessible toilet as an all gender toilet, because that has many, many problems in terms of like disabled people not having enough access to toilets anyway. So yeah, I've talked for a long time. I could talk for ages about toilets, but I'll stop.
I think it's really, really fascinating. Some of those key points that you made there that I just didn't even think about, being really blunt, things like when you said about putting smellies in a toilet, and then how clinical a disabled toilet might be, and the really subtle messages about who's included and who's not included, or the judgments that an environment might make about a person, the messages that spaces like toilets might send to people. And I love that phrase. I'm going to look at that research about expected participants, because I think that ties right back to some of the things that Zara was saying at the start about how it shouldn't be an add-on, that we remove barriers to access. We should have created spaces that feel like we expect all participants in the first place. So yeah, thank you. On the toilets one, there's a really brilliant podcast by Caroline Priez about toilets and the history of the development of gendered toilets and how far they had to be and stuff. So there's loads of additional stuff along with Tig's.
Just on that, I think I wouldn't trust that person's trans politics. You have to look for the red flags, but they are there.
Okay, fair point, Tig. I wouldn't have considered it from that lens. It's very gendered. The podcasting article is very gendered, but it's a good point. So read it through a trans inclusive lens and make your own judgments. Thank you. Okay, so we've started to think about like, well, what do our toilets in our spaces, what's the message that they might send to people about who's included and who isn't included? Zara, I'd like to come to you to extend that a little bit. because I think one of the things that you talked about when you talked to our colleagues was stuff about sort of like group dynamics and spaces just beyond buildings. So can you talk to us a little bit about that, please?
Yep. So it's kind of going back a little bit to what I was saying earlier, but depending on whether you're doing like a one-off activity with young people or a longer term engagement with them, if you're doing a one-off activity, I would be collecting as much information you can about what you've put in place around access, what are the features of where you're doing the activity, like how do you get there, but also like what are you planning to do, not necessarily spoiling it, but so that people can make a judgment about whether they can take part if it's a one-off activity. Also, really, really important, if you're doing an activity and you want to be inclusive, give a named contact that someone can contact in advance and ask questions, because that will be the difference between someone coming or not coming if they've got additional needs that they are used to not having met. Related to that, if you're working with people on a longer term basis, I always put in like the forms that I collect information on them. What can I do, or what can we do to help you participate in what we're doing? And I give examples like breaks, like snacks, like different things that might help someone be able to like take part and continue to be involved. I also have a question of, is there anything you would like other people in the group to know about, so that they can be inclusive of you? So for example, I've worked in groups where young people have had photosensitive epilepsy. So what they've wanted the group to know, without necessarily relating to them, is please don't take flash photographs because it will cause people to have a seizure. Like sometimes people want access information about themselves related to themselves because it's very specific. Like if a young person's got brittle bone, they want people to know that they have brittle bone so they don't just ram into them. But sometimes, because of stigma, they might not want the whole world and the universe to know it's about them. But let's build into group agreements like ideas that support that person's participation. So, for example, it might be that someone said that they find it really difficult to pick up on social cues in a group. So you might do things as a facilitator to like put rules into how people are engaging in the activity. Now, that doesn't need to be related to Jane, but it might be as a direct consequence. So it's thinking about how you create space to have conversations about access and inclusion, and also being really aware that although as a youth worker you set up a space, actually whether someone feels included might be down to the actions or behaviours of other people in the group. So how do you support that to be a positive experience for people, whether it's talking about what people need or creating ground rules or just generally thinking about the power dynamics that might exist in the group. The other thing that I think is quite important is to understand, like, quite often people will ask me, what do you need to be able to take part, or what do you need to access this? And I'm like, what am I doing? Because actually, to answer that is very dependent on what I'm being asked to do, where it is, lots of information that I might not have access to. So things like I've seen done really well by some youth work settings is that they've done videos of their youth centres so that someone can watch a video before they decide to take part in an activity, so that they understand what their access might be like. So then when they're asked, do you need anything, they might be able to say, I need someone to help me get to the toilets because they're hidden in a corner and no one knows where they are. So providing information so that people can actually respond in a meaningful way to your questions. And like also, one of the things that happens quite a lot is people get so anxious about being accessible that they make things boring because they're trying to make them accessible. And actually, disabled young people and young people in general want to do things that are fun. And it's our job to then work out how they can be made fun and accessible rather than obsessing over like access.
I've literally written about a page and a half of notes there, Zara. Thank you so much. I really, like, I had a bit of a light bulb moment when you were talking about like just being much more transparent with information. And I was thinking about how we might plan activities generally, and we might do a site visit and we'll do a risk assessment. But that little suggestion about film a walk around so that you can show it to it, like it's such a simple adjustment to our practice, but just transforms and make it available to everybody. I'm sure lots of people will have been making notes with some of the things that you were talking there about, those prompt questions about how can we make this space more how can we enable you to participate? What are the things that we might need to put in, and making that an option for everybody? Just, yeah, absolutely. Really, really small, but really transformational. And it's bedding those things into our practice at every stage systemically, rather than as a bolt-on just for a specific young person that really leads to inclusive practice, right? I could almost put my wages on the fact that you're going to get some people contacting you for, have you got any copies or examples of those sort of like access and information questions that you do? So anything that you're happy to share, or get in touch with Zara. I'm sure Zara does some advisory work. Jo, can I kind of sort of stretch this a bit more and ask you to talk a little bit about what we heard Zara talk about there was very much about like, actually, this is on us as the worker to ensure that our spaces are inclusive and that we ask the right questions and create the right environment. But I guess your work is about how young people shape and adjust and create challenge. So could you talk to us a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, I guess to lead into that, I just wanted to reflect on something Tig had mentioned around that sense of belonging. So I don't think it's a stretch to say that, you know, pretty much all people want to belong, and that is no different for disabled young people. And I think it's their sense of sort of needing to sort of engage and be part of that, you know, linking all the way back to when we were talking about the social model of disability. That means there's just so much value in what disabled young people tell us when we're thinking about systems, because actually we're challenging the system because it is excluding them in some way, in some shape, in some form, whether we are thinking about a community system, a health and education, a social care, you know, whatever that might be, the system doesn't work for them. And so working to shape that with them helps to increase that sense of belonging. You know, I feel Zara's just given so many like amazing examples of how you practically do that in that day-to-day engagement work. And I think, for, you know, to be really transparent, National Children's Bureau doesn't deliver youth provision in that traditional sense. We don't have youth services. The real sort of strength of this voice work is around, you know, focus group advisory, sort of like local to regional to national. So I think it's about always assuming, you know, that assume we can is always assuming that young people actually are interested in that system, in that piece of work, whether that's internally within your own organisation, or more widely. So if I can give an example, and I'll sort of just use a personal one from National Children's Bureau, is that we work with disabled young people, but they are not only disabled young people. The intersectionality through their lives, whether it is their ethnicity, their geographical location, whether they identify, you know, being a northerner or southerner, you know, whether they identify in terms of the world that they want to change, or the things that they want to do as they age, and sort of all of that information is, you know, it comes with a wealth of voice and advocacy. So, you know, at the moment we've been doing lots of work around diversity and equity and inclusion work, but actually, why would we not ask young people to help us shape that work with their their whole lived identities and experiences. So I think there is like real value in not being worried about asking young people, does this work? Does this not work? I think there is that whole thing that young people are just going to tell you it doesn't work and then full stop. But actually, we know through youth work that is absolutely not the case. And if we support young people to to come on that journey with us and help them direct the journey as well, I think the outcome can be incredibly positive. I know, Zara, you've got your hand up. Do you want to come in at this point?
Keep going.
I mean, I was pretty much finished, to be honest, but I think, the physicality in the space is one thing, and it's incredibly important, but it's also around that content of what we want young people to be able to do and to change. Just anecdotally, we run a young people's conference every year. So Disabled Young People's Conference, it's really specific, but actually finding a venue for it is a year-long task. Like, there's 1 or 2 venues in the entirety of England that can support this conference in terms of accessibility. And so, yeah, you need to get that groundwork right. But if the content when they get there is really dull and really boring, then you've also missed the mark. So getting young people to design what that conference looks like and design what we talk about and to lead it as well. I think there's something really powerful in young people taking the lead and other young people seeing disabled young people take the lead. Because the confidence that inspires is really profound.
Yeah, I think so. Just passing over to Zara, but I think that you were talking there about physicality, but also connectivity and belonging, and like young people shaping events where they feel like they belong and taking charge. Zara, did you want to come in on that as well?
Yeah, just 2 things. One thing I forgot from earlier, and one thing from what Joanna just said. We're in a situation at the moment where a lot of disabled children and young people are not having the best time. Like, they're not getting the support that they need to thrive. It's well documented in the press, and it creates a lot of dynamics. A lot of disabled young people now are actually more activists than when I was a young person, because the environment is more hostile, so they really do care about stuff and want to get involved. So it's about actually expecting them to want to get involved in lots of different stuff, in part because of what they've experienced. Related to that, and what I forgot from earlier, is because of the challenges we're facing around support for disabled children and young people in a literal physical sense. A lot of disabled children and young people at the moment are quite dependent on their parents and family members to be able to take part in like extracurricular activities, and sometimes even curricular activities, because of just what's going on in the world at the moment. And so there is something also about thinking about that dynamic. We're also in a situation where youth work is chronically underfunded. So in an ideal world, can you have more bodies in the room to actually support participation, as in more youth workers, so that disabled young people don't have to rely on family members or like power dynamics of care from other young people in order to be able to take part? But also, given that that's kind of an unfortunate reality at the moment, what are you doing to like make it as comfortable as possible? Are you having, for example, spaces where family members or others might be able to go and sit that's separate from your youth work activity, so you don't have your mum in your room? You're not going to want to talk about your boyfriends, girlfriends, or others if your mum sat next to you. Like, one of my proudest youth work moments was enabling an 18-year-old to have his first peer-to-peer conversation with someone of his own age, because I managed to create an environment where someone else could understand his speech impediment, so he was able to have a conversation without having to go for an adult for the first time ever. And like, actually, it's really important that we give young people the space to talk to one another without being moderated by adults, but also that we acknowledge the realities of the current world, and that we're doing things that mean they don't have to necessarily be in the room, even if they are supporting participation, and that we place like the power of deciding how that works with young people rather than with adults being scared of risk assessments and whatever else. Like, young people know what they can and can't do the best. It's our responsibility to ask the questions to make sure that we can keep them safe and that they can be involved in the ways that they want to. And it goes back to what Tig was saying earlier. It becomes really important that we're not expecting everyone to do a hip hop dance to express themselves, that we're giving people options, because hopefully someone will choose the option that's most appropriate for what their needs are. If they don't, then improvise, but we shouldn't be relying on a system that says that if you have needs, you're going to need to bring your parent along.
It's the exclusionary nature of that, isn't it? And that's not good youth work, and it's certainly not what we would want for our young people. I think some really powerful things in there, and I think I just want to touch on the point that you started with, which was about the real social challenges and the barriers that young people, disabled young people, are experiencing with accessing what they're entitled to and what they need. And I just wondered, Tig, whether there was anything that you wanted to add to that in terms of broadening that out to sort of intersectional identities. So you were talking a minute ago about like trans and disabled young people and access to toilets and stuff. So is there anything else that you'd want to sort of share with us or bring to us from your research about what people might need to really be thinking about?
In terms of social context, like, I mean, to go back to the beginning of this conversation, like, we need these young people to be thinking about how the world can be different, because the world is not a good place right now for disabled people and for anybody that's kind of marginalized in whatever way. Trans young people, many of whom will also be disabled, have had any access to healthcare pretty much taken away. In terms of trans, like, gender affirming healthcare, it's gone. There's medically transitioning is pretty much impossible. Social transitioning is becoming harder and harder, and there's attempts to like make that not possible within a school setting. It is possible at the minute. Like, there's nothing that stops that happening, but there was, previous non-statutory policy put in that was kind of a consultative document by the Tories, which attempted to stop social transitioning and out trans young people to their parents. It's completely unsafe, life-threatening, really. So trans young people are having a really shit time, to like put it bluntly, a really, really bad time. Trans people generally are having a really bad time, but I think there's particular things going on for young people. To be aware of that, to like, people aren't, a lot of the time, young people aren't going to talk to you about being trans, and might not talk to you about anything unless you make it very explicit that that you are a person who's safe to talk to about that. And that's more than just like wearing a rainbow pin badge or something is like a starting point, I guess, but that's not the end point. Like, going back to the question of accessibility, making sure there's like non-gendered toilets in your setting, and letting people know what it is, like being really explicit that this is a trans exclusive, a trans inc, not exclusive, that's the opposite of what we want, a trans inclusive setting is really important. As a trans person myself, I don't trust people unless they make it clear to me that they are on the right side of this right now, because it's a scary we're in a really scary place, and I think we're in a really scary place for disabled people in terms of like having any kind of rights, kind of social security, any of that kind of ripped away. It's a really scary place to be a trans person, because at the same time there's an attempt to eliminate us from public life, and I think it's as blunt as that. I think that's what's going on right now in terms of trying to stopping people access toilets stops people accessing public life, and I think that's what's happening right now. And I think trans young people are very aware of that, and it needs to be made very explicit that if you want trans young people, many of whom are disabled, to come and feel comfortable in your setting, then you need to make it very explicit that they're welcome and where you stand on this.
Thanks, Tig. I think that's yeah, it's a really, really, really key point. Leads us nicely into the next bit, but it's about being explicit about being an inclusive environment and being explicit about those particular components and what you are actively seeking and displaying in the way that you behave and the way that you show up and the way that you set up your environments to demonstrate that to young people, to help them to feel safe. I think Zara talked a little bit about that, about young people might not, the stigma that's attached to various different components of identity, particularly disability from this particular conversation, is already difficult. And so we need to be removing any sort of additional barriers to being able to be open and connecting to a place where you feel safe to be yourself. I think that was kind of the key messaging, right?
Yeah, I was just thought when I was talking then. So some research I've done recently has been about queer people's relationships to the rainbow flag, and one thing that came up very strongly from young people in particular was that actually seeing a rainbow flag don't mean that much, but seeing a trans flag or seeing a non-binary flag or seeing an asexual flag or seeing those do mean things to young people. So actually thinking about the kind of imagery that's around beyond that rainbow flag can mean quite a lot. And it's quite a simple thing to do.
It is, and I think there's something in that which comes back to the early conversations that we're having as well about adults assuming that they know stuff around an issue that has no bearing. And what I mean by that is like, you use the word queer, for example. I've got some friends who are older who don't like that word because for them that would be stigmatizing, whereas for young people that I work with, it's a really inclusive word. And I think this comes back to the point that both Zara and Joanna made, which is about ask the question. Like you just said, young people say they don't particularly connect with flag X, but they do connect with flag Y. And if we're talking about creating inclusive environments, the people who should be given the power to shape that should be the young people that we're seeking to work with, right? Zara, you were waiting to come in, apologies.
Yeah, just building on what Tig just shared. One of the things that happens quite a lot to disabled young people if they disclose that they're disabled is that everything in the space becomes essentialized to the fact that they're disabled. So they're not often allowed space to have more than one identity, but the reality is that they do have more than one identity. A few years ago, I was doing an activity which young people had to apply for that was about multiple discrimination. We had like 80 applications for 20 places, and our first question, it was for disabled young people, but it was looking at multiple discrimination, and our first question was, do you experience discrimination on any other grounds than being disabled? Of the 80 applications, about 60 of the 80 were from people identifying as female or non-binary or trans. Out of those 60 applications, only 4 of the applicants put being female, trans or non-binary as an additional form of discrimination that they experience beyond being disabled. So actually allowing people to be in spaces and let them choosing the identities that they bring to the fore, rather than assuming that just because a young person's in a wheelchair, what they're going to want to talk about is being in a wheelchair. They might want to talk about being non-binary and negotiating that. Like actually allowing people to be whole people, that they choose what they bring into a space, rather than pigeonholing them into you have visibly this, so we're only going to ask you about this.
Yeah, so really centering the whole person as opposed to trying to pick off aspects of somebody's identity. And I guess what you said was allowing young people to express what it is that they want to bring into the space, rather than creating a space that's sort of like only about one particular component. I think this is a really good moment to kind of sort of move the conversation on slightly to, I was going to talk specifically about what needs to change, but I think we've heard reams and reams of ideas on some of the things that need to change. So we need to kind of broaden that out a little bit slightly. But I think, I guess what I'm really wondering is, what's the real golden rule, or what's the really strong message, the thing that you think people should really, really prioritize, that's going to make a difference in the way that they show up and work with young people, particularly those with disabilities and sort of other intersectionalities that bring marginalisation. So if you could change one thing, or encourage people to change one thing, what would it be? And then I'm going to stretch that, and I'm going to say, and what's the one thing that you wish people that might work with young people, broadly speaking, because I know, Tiggy, I'm not a youth worker and I don't want to kind of pigeonhole, but could understand or practice better. So kind of what's your, if people go away from this today and the only thing they remember is one thing, what's that one thing that you want them to remember? And I'm not going to pick on anyone to come first. I'm going to just leave it with you to like go, yeah, I'm ready. I want to come in on this one.
I can go if you want. I think what I would take away is to question your idea of what adulthood looks like, because I think we think of young people as kind of somewhere between child and adult, and we're kind of working towards this adulthood, and often the questions are very like adulthood orientated, like, you know, what do you want to do when you grow up? For example, will you have a partner? Blah, blah, blah. So to question like what a good adulthood looks like, I think helps us to rethink what youth looks like as well, or what young people might need or want.
I love that. Rethink what a good adulthood looks like, because we often talk about, there's cohort studies on good childhood and child-friendly cities and what does it, but do we ever reframe what a good adulthood might look like? Yeah, I like that. And work with young people to explore that. Okay. Zara, over to you.
I have two things, but I think they fit both of your one things. The first thing is to get over yourself. Like, your discomfort, your not knowing what to do is not a young person's problem. Like, actually, you just need to kind of grab the bull by the horns and ask the questions. You're not, no one expects you to be an expert in like 56 million people. So actually, don't hesitate in doing something because you don't feel like you know what you're doing. Say to the person, say to the space, I don't know what I'm doing, or I'm learning and we'll do this together, rather than not doing it at all. A lot of the time, disabled children and young people are excluded by non-disabled adults' fear of not knowing what to do with them. And actually, you just need to work it out and go and like do and work it out as you go along. That's the only way anyone ever learns anything, by navigating together with the young people how you do this thing in an accessible way that works for them. The second thing, which is, if I could ask people to do one thing, it's not to forget joy. And that's like, life is hard. Being a disabled young person is hard work. Being a young person that experiences any marginalisation or discrimination is hard work. And quite a lot of the time, we get so kind of engrossed in how hard it is that we forget to have a joke. We forget to have joy. We forget to celebrate. We forget to just like have fun and be human beings. Like, the world at the moment is such a kind of bonfire of different things going on that it can be really difficult for young people to have a sense of hope, have a sense of future, have a sense of all of these things. And actually, that's one of the biggest things that youth work can give young people, is a place of joy, a place of like celebration, and like the serious stuff matters as well. Like, we
Yeah.
need to give space to that, but it shouldn't be one or the other.
So don't take yourself too seriously. Don't take things too seriously. Just ask and don't be afraid to make mistakes. And don't forget joy and fun. Against a backdrop of, we can rethink what fun and adulthood might look like. Joanna, over to you.
I should have gone first. I should have been brave.
I know, right? It's like everybody always gets all this stuff out.
Not sure how to follow both of you. I think one of the key things to remember is that the change and success comes in many, many different shapes and sizes. And in our work with young people, sometimes we wait to celebrate the big milestones or the big changes, but actually lots of steps go up to make that big change. You know, it's a cumulative effect and impact. And I would say supporting young people to recognise those small successes and how it all builds can have a transformative impact on how young people choose to then share their lived experiences and share their voices and sort of shape even the youth work that we deliver to young people. So yeah, I guess my thing is success in all shapes and sizes are really great achievements.
Success in all shapes and sizes, and don't forget the moments to stop and celebrate those little bits on the journey. Thank you. Okay, we have had a couple of questions come through, if you're okay to answer that, or if they're answerable, but I won't come to anybody specifically. I'll just raise them, and then if you feel like actually I've got something to say here, hopefully you'll come forward. So we've had 3 or 4 come through. So somebody asked a question about, is there best practice, or is there anywhere I can go to find out what best practice might be around engaging with young people with disabilities and social media? So I think what they're saying is, like, we want to be really inclusive to all young people in our local area. What might we need to do? Zara, and then Joanna.
So one thing is that thinking about how disabled young people might be accessing social media, and if they're accessing it at all. So if you're producing stuff on social media, try and make sure you're producing it in other forms as well, because for some disabled people, social media is just not accessible, or their access to social media is gatekept because of fears of safety, etc. In terms of actual social media, like, and making it accessible, things like using camel case hashtags so that they are readable by screen readers, putting image descriptions on posts so that people can access them even if they can't see the image, using the alt text function on social media, doing captionings, thinking about, like, is what you're producing for social media actually followable, or is it like all over the place and not really clear? Like, having follow-up places that people can go to find out more information. like there are some really good resources that are out there about basically making social media accessible. They apply to young people as well. One of the things I would say, and it's a small proportion of disabled young people, but there are disabled young people for whom social media just isn't accessible. So it's then thinking about the networks which you're disseminating information about what you're doing through, and are they reaching the places that those young people might have access to.
Thanks, Sarah. Joanna.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think there's also, you know, everything that Zara just mentioned around like practical access and you know, whether it's the right medium for young people, but there's also like the actual creating the content of social media and engaging young people in creating that, so it's actually what young people want to see, and there are some, you know, things that can support that. So there's lots of like year-long calendars at the moment that highlight particular months or weeks or days, you know, whether it's around disability or other really important issues. So it's currently Pride Month. So, you know, planning for young people to help create content around Pride Month and sort of sharing why it's important to them, if that's a safe space for them to do that. It doesn't necessarily have to be a visual thing if, you know, if they don't want to be showing their faces or anything like that. But yeah, sort of planning that in and sort of working with young people about what's safe to share and what isn't and what they feel comfortable with, and helping them to record that content that then you can maybe put out on your organisation's channel, so that other young people also know that no, this is a real safe and inclusive space. And that can also, you know, it's also South Asian Celebration Month this month, and you know, we obviously have Black History Month and lots of others as well, you know, autism awareness. So think about things that young people will find important, ask them, and then sort of shape your social media work around that. I think is a really helpful way of getting young people to share the things that are particularly important to them.
Thanks, Joanna. Okay, we've got time for another one, if that's okay. This is quite a complex question. I think I'm going to think Tig might answer, or I have an answer to this because it's quite structural. So the question was, how do we challenge legislations or policies that disproportionately affect young people from marginalised groups? So they were specifically thinking about the handling of misinformation and different things, and given a few examples. So they were talking about like policy and legislation change really influences what's happening on the ground. Tig, you made reference to that. Yeah, so what can we do with that?
It's hard, isn't it? I think it's really hard. I think it's hard. It's a hard question. It probably depends on what the policy or legislation is that you're talking about as well, and also whether you're talking as an individual, as a workplace, etc. I mean, the current thing that's in my head at the minute is there's a consultation open on the EHRC guidance, which came on the back of the Supreme Court ruling, which was the thing I keep referring to about trans people access to gendered spaces. There's a consultation that's open. You can respond to that as an organisation. I've been involved in the response from my workplace, which is going down a line of none of this is organisationally possible to police toilets in this way, and it also doesn't fit with our inclusive practices. But that consultation is weighted in a particular way, which makes actually answering it quite difficult, I think, or answering it in a way that you'd want to answer it quite difficult. You can also do things like, you know, email your MP, email people in power. Yeah, I'm sure Joanna would have things to say about like getting young people involved in that kind of thing in those processes themselves, but also bearing in mind, I suppose, that I mean, trans stuff is probably what I know most in recent years, and we've been hit with consultation after consultation after consultation. So sometimes actually not doing that could be a bit of self-care too, from like, you know, not assuming that young people would necessarily want to engage in this consultation because they want to be doing other things and other kind of community-based work. And I think there's like a balance to be found between putting our energy into kind of challenging policy, and I think that's really valuable things for organisations to do and should be doing that, but also thinking about, well, what can we do on the ground? And that's where youth work's really important, to kind of create the spaces that are fun and lighthearted, and a place to not always think about like our rights being taken away and so on. So I don't know if that answers the question, but it feels like a big one at the minute.
Yeah, I think it does. I am going to come to you in a second, Zara. I guess that just breaking down those points that Tig said, I think they're really important. Is like, we can address things on a structural level through consultations and stuff, but equally it's about how we're supporting at grassroots level and in the work that we do. And then coinciding that with the work that Joanna was talking about, which was about supporting young people to have a voice in the places that they want to create change, whilst also recognising that consultation fatigue is a thing, right? And constantly having to talk about, constantly having to be your identity or battle, as which I think was something Zara was talking about earlier on. People have multifaceted identities, not just one label that we give them, and being sensitive to that in our work. Zara, we are almost out of time, so I think you're probably going to have some of the last words. So off you go. What did you want to add?
It was just, I fully agree with everything that's been said. There's something about, when looking at policy in particular, actually looking at pathways to create access between young people and the decision makers. One of the things I've experienced working in this space is that often decision makers on policy are doing so based on assumptions that are not based on the reality of living as a young person today. Obviously, that should only be done when it's safe, and at the moment it's not always safe to do that, like, because of how divided some policy issues are. But I found that actually having young people at the table with policymakers and decision makers is often the best way and the most effective way of making policies youth friendly.
Yeah, so sometimes it's about budging up as an adult, isn't it? Budging up and making room for the voices that have got something meaningful to say and allowing them to create change. I am going to squeeze in one more question because we've got 2 minutes, if that's okay, because I think it's really important. It links to what you were saying, Tig, which is why I'm kind of wheedling in, is we've had a couple of questions related to staff wellbeing and worker wellbeing. And actually, like, around, we're talking about advocacy and we're talking about managing our work and ourselves against often really tricky, difficult situations and backlash, so how can we motivate and support ourselves and each other to really keep themselves well once they're, when they're working in this space of challenging? Joanna?
I think some of it comes back to what Zara was saying earlier around keeping the joy and focusing around positive things. But there's also something to be said for really practical things like debriefings at end of sessions, and actually what was heavy, what worked well, what didn't work well, what are we being left with, and actually where can we get some support from other organisations for that. I think we all know that the youth work is chronically underfunded and underappreciated, and the value of it is really underestimated, and that obviously has an impact on morale. But I think sometimes even things like asking a young person what they enjoyed about the session can help you think about actually what you are doing really well. So I think sometimes it's building up different areas of access and support that can help, and also just joining other professional networks and things as well, and knowing that other people are absolutely going to be feeling this way as well, and meeting up for coffees and things informally. I'll hand over to Zara before the time runs out.
Zara?
Really simply, you are only responsible for what you hold. Like, the world might be falling to pieces, but if you can create a haven for an hour, 2 hours a day, whatever it might be, that's your contribution. Like, you don't have to try and fix everything. You're not responsible for all of the ills in the world. Like, you can't fix everything. So celebrate what you have managed to do rather than what you haven't.
Lovely. What a lovely note to end on. Celebrate those moments of joy and what you can bring and what you contribute. I'd just like to thank all of the panelists. Honestly, I could have easily done another hour and a half solidly on this, but appreciate people have got other things to do. Karen will send out a follow-up from this about different information. She's put something in the chat about other sessions that we're running. Once again, thank you to all the panelists, to all the people that have attended and contributed with questions and stuff, and hopefully we'll see some of you again for the follow-up sessions that we're running across the rest of the year. We've got 3 more sessions on this topic coming, so thanks everybody, take care and have a lovely rest of your day.